A rare earthquake struck Maine today, just off the coast, 5 miles southeast of York, magnitude 3.8, with a depth of more than 8 miles. It traveled 60 miles in 1 second as the earthquake moved through. I could feel it in the chair I'm sitting in right now as I was making the forecast this morning. Ran downstairs to check the boiler, but it was not a boiler issue. It was not a plow. It was not a plane. It was this earthquake right here, which originated where the star is, right off the coast, the southern tip of the southern coast of York County, York Harbor, Maine, the Gulf of Maine. Here's Portland where they felt it, Augusta where they felt it, the mid coast, right up towards Penobscot Bay, very close, up in the White Mountains, up around Coos County, New Hampshire, and all the way back down to Hartford, back to Providence, and yes, the South Shore, the Cape, the North Shore, Boston, they felt it. But right here is where those immediate kind of impacts were and the feeling of the earthquake. So let's take a look now. I want to show you in more detail and pull the curtain back and show you this. So here's your shake map. So the U.S. Geological Survey shows where you can feel the shaking. And there's a rating here from not felt, which is basically nothing, to weak, light, moderate, strong, and very strong. So you see here, this is all pretty light to weak, okay, at the most here. So not obviously a very significant earthquake, but for us here in Maine, it is significant, and in New England, because we don't get these very often. We don't get around a 4 very often. So I'll show you here once again. Here's the location. Here's where the epicenter, right here on the surface, and then the source is about 10 miles down south of that, about 8 to 10 miles underground in the Gulf of Maine. Here's Portsmouth. Here's Cape Nettic. Here's York. So about 5 miles southeast of that. This is where I am. This is where I felt it on the second floor of my home, right here in Kennebunkport, is where I felt it. And people said that, yes, they felt things like things shaking in their house. But you really have with this kind of an earthquake, things like the chimney. You got to watch the chimney because that's where you could have problems with an earthquake like this. So here's the official recording in from the National U.S. Geological Survey out of York Harbor, Maine, okay, just southeast. There it is, a 3.8. So it is official. They did review this. 3.8, about 10 kilometers southeast. So it's obviously about 5 miles or so southeast of York Harbor in the Gulf of Maine, where you had the earthquake. But I really want to talk in more detail about things like the safety. If this was to happen again, what do you need to do to stay safe? So during an earthquake, protect yourself right away. If you're in a car, pull over and stop. And interestingly enough, a lot of people that were driving did not feel this. But if you're at a stoplight or a red light, you certainly, a stop sign or a red light, you certainly could feel it. Set your parking brake and stay in the car. If you're in bed, turn face down, cover your head and neck with a pillow. If you're outdoors, stay outdoors away from buildings. And if you're inside, do not run outside because the chimney could peel off and crash on you, or even a tree, but more likely the chimney. So they want you to stay indoors. Now, I have a blog up on jasonnappyweather.com about this rare earthquake that rocks southern Maine on jasonnappyweather.com. But I'm going to go into a lot more detail in a second here, so make sure you're staying tuned. I also did a video, kind of a raw video on Facebook Live about the breaking news about the earthquake. Now, let's get into more detail about this earthquake, okay? So, earthquakes are obviously natural disasters. They're hazards. Okay, this is a really good diagram here by the USGS. It shows where that focus is right here, and then also shows where the epicenter is at the surface. So the surface, southeast of York Harbor, right here was where the epicenter was for this earthquake. Also, one thing to point out, that the magnitude of these earthquakes, they're not just a California problem, although obviously California gets them regularly with many in the way of fault lines, especially the San Andreas especially. But in southern Maine and in central Maine, you see here, we're about a medium hazard risk. So this is not just a California problem here. So if you do research on this, you can really kind of peel the layers back. So look at this map. Very interesting to show you that with a 5 to a 5.9, Okay, these earthquakes don't happen very often. There was one up here, up around Lake Champlain, up around upstate New York, so up around Watertown, New York. But there's been a few orange ones here, here, and here, southern Maine and central New Hampshire Lakes region, which were in the 4 to 4.9. And that is where we were very close to today. And that's where you get things like chimney damage. So watch out for that. And this can happen, once again, in a place like southern Maine. And history of earthquakes in the Northeast go back decades, hundreds of years, I should say centuries. 1727, there was an earthquake on October 29th that rattled the East Coast from Maine to Pennsylvania, 5.6 in Newburyport, Massachusetts. So this happens generally, I will talk about it more, in about 30 to 50 years that you can see earthquakes in the Northeast. So here's a map here showing where the big ones were. Up around Quebec, up here just northwest, the Boundary Plateau, in Canada. And then here's one, there's one over in New York, right around Watertown, right Lake Champlain. Okay, but there's all these yellow dots. These are magnitudes that are less than that 5 here. So a lot of force, but the bigger these kind of squares, the more impact, the bigger the earthquake here. So you see those happening quite a bit. Now, state-specific information is a great website, by the way, on nesec.org. I'll put it in the blog. Great website. Significant earthquakes in the Northeast U.S. and adjacent Canada. Here's a 5.9 down east Maine. Let's take a look at the time on when that one popped up. That was back in the early 1900s, okay? So you see that. And then you've got New Hampshire, back towards Massachusetts. You've got several here, 1700s, 1600s, and then up here around New York, and then here obviously up in Canada around not too far from Quebec. So you've got plenty of earthquake history here. This does happen, not just, once again, not just in California. This also happens in the Northeast, in New England. So you can click on your state here, like here, you can click on Maine and get a full breakdown. Watch this. You can get a full breakdown of Maine history and earthquakes here. And that talks about the map I just showed you. It goes back to 1973 and 1904. Those were damaging earthquakes in Maine. From all the way back to 1700s, this goes back, this research. So it's really remarkable. Now, as far as the mitigation measures, we can read all about that here. It's a great website. Take a look at the geologic faults. So this is very interesting. If you take a look here in Maine, you've got a fault line here in down east Maine going just north of the mid-coast. You've got another one here in central Maine, north of Augusta. So there are faults. Now, there's a lot more activity here, upstate New York, northwestern New Jersey, and also around Westchester. So, yeah, we got a lot in Massachusetts, out right over Boston. So this is, once again, not a California thing. You've got a lot in the way of fault lines happening here, and in New England, okay, in the Northeast. So if you're wondering what causes earthquakes in the Northeast, so right here, you've got your tectonic plates here, okay, and these right now are rubbing up against other plates. Some are moving away, some are moving on top of them, or underneath, or sliding. So you've got a Pacific Ocean plate on the West Coast, the U.S. and Canadian West Coast. You got this going on right here. That's obviously a big one. So you've got the Juan de Fuca plate that's happening. So with these plates rubbing up against each other, you obviously are going to have friction and you're going to have issues. You're going to have the release of that pressure. You're going to have earthquakes here. So there are different earthquakes, though, in the Northeast and New England versus what happens in California. So a magnitude 6.0 earthquake in California doesn't go very far. But a magnitude 5.8 in a place like Central Virginia on the East Coast, look at how far this travels. It can travel 1,000 miles. In California, it might only travel 100 miles. So on the U.S. East Coast, earthquakes have far more distance, even though they typically don't have the magnitude, but they can do more damage over a farther distance. Scientists cannot predict earthquakes just yet here as I'm going through this. here's something you might be wondering about. What about the average repeat time for an earthquake in the Northeast? So we just had a 3.8. So check this out. For a 5.0, the return time is 30 to 47 years. So we weren't quite a 5, but 30 to 47 years. So you have to look back. When was the last 5? And then go 30 to 47 years out, and then you'd have your target range for when you'd get, obviously, a northeast, once again, northeast earthquake. That would be right around that 5.0 number, magnitude. So as far as earthquake early warning basics, you want, there are alert centers and sensors, but here's the problem, is that these happen so quickly, these earthquakes, you only get seconds. So there's really not a way to be safe to prevent, to do early warning detection for these earthquakes. If a strong earthquake hits the Northeast, the first thing that's going to happen is your chimney is going to start to crumble. So that's why you want to stay indoors and be away from the chimney, and have something protecting your head and not run outside, because the chimney could go before you. So here's what you drop, you cover, and you hold on. Protect your head, protect your neck. Those are the most vulnerable areas on your body. And then there's a whole thing here about earthquake definition. So this is a great site. I'll put it on the blog, nesc.org. You can go to nappycast.com, jasonnappyweather.com, and I'll break all this stuff down here. But this is the earthquake today that happened right over southern Maine. I was just a few miles from it. I felt it. This desk I'm sitting at was shaking. The ground was shaking. The last earthquake I was in Augusta, Georgia, after an ice storm. And weather and earthquakes are separate. Okay, weather does not impact earthquakes. So let's get that out of the way. All right, thank you so much for watching. JasonNappyWeather.com and NappyCast. Hope you have a great rest of your day.